So, are there any Spidey villains who haven't gotten a movie yet? Yes, quite a few it turns out. You gotta give the Spider-Man movies credit. By now, almost every major villain has had their time to shine on the big screen. But Spidey's rogues gallery is massive, so there's no shortage of powerful foes who have yet to make their movie debut. So let's take a look at some of them. And just to make it harder for myself, I'm not gonna count Kraven, Chameleon, or Scorpion. One is getting his own movie, and the other two have had cameos in their civil identities. You escaped my ranting this time, Michael Mando. Now, as much as I like to praise the Spider-Man films for making sure we're always seeing new villains, there is one name that keeps popping up time and time again. The Green Goblin. And believe me, I get it. The character is one of Spidey's greatest enemies, and it's hard to resist the temptation to include him when you're working with everyone's favorite wall crawler. But come on, we've seen the Green Goblin so many times, and there are other goblins who deserve the spotlight. Like the Hobgoblin. Hobgoblin started out as a corrupt fashion designer by the name of Roderick Kingsley, who made his career by stealing designs from others. When he stumbled upon Norman Osborn's hideout and all of his goblin gear, Kingsley then decided to do the exact same thing. He recolored the outfit and added a cape, and just like that, the Hobgoblin was born. Now, we might have just established that the Hobgoblin is just a cheap Green Goblin knockoff in-universe, but he actually does have a few things going for him that differentiates him from Old Green. Like his habit of brainwashing other people to take up the Hobgoblin name and take the fall if his plan should fail, like he did to many people in the comics. And remember, this includes Peter's friend Ned Leeds, who could make for a pretty interesting villain in a future MCU movie now that he no longer remembers who Peter actually is. That definitely would add some bittersweetness to the I promise to never turn evil bit from No Way Home now, wouldn't it? You know, despite being known as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, we've seen very little of Spidey's street-level heroics in movies so far. Sure, there's usually a montage of him looking out for the little guy, but soon enough he'll get into some big crisis against larger-than-life supervillains who want to get revenge on someone, blow up a major city, or some other over-the-top craziness. But in the comics, the New York underworld is crawling with colorful characters that Spidey regularly dukes it out with. These are gangsters who may not have bigger ambitions than their next payload, but who are way too much trouble for the police to handle. Whether we're talking about geriatric cyborgs like Silvermane, masked crime bosses like the Crime Master, the Big Man in the Rose, or even just muscle like Tombstone, Hammerhead, and the Enforcers, it would be kind of cool to see Spidey get involved in some supervillain turf wars. And if we count mercenaries, we can throw Silver Sable in there for the thirsty people in the audience. Oh, you know who you are. Don't deny it. Besides, some of them do have potential to be pretty big threats. Like Mr. Negative, the evil alternate personality of the altruistic Martin Lee, whose powers let him corrupt others. Set him up as the next big mob boss, let his inner demons run amok in New York City, have all the others try to fight back against him and put Spider-Man in the middle, and all of a sudden we have ourselves a super entertaining brawl. Okay, so how many was that? 1, 2, 3... Oh, 11 villains in one segment! I'm on a roll! Everybody loved Into the Spider-Verse, and rightfully so. It's a gorgeous movie, it's packed to the brim with excellent action, and it introduced many popular Spider characters to a wider audience. It also has basically nothing to do with the comic book event that inspired it, which featured a completely different antagonist, Morlun. You know that thing tough guys do in movies where they say things like, "I eat guys like you for breakfast"? Well, this guy actually does eat Spider-Man for breakfast. And lunch. And dinner. And dessert. And as a midnight snack. Morlun is part of a strange reality-hopping family of beings called the Inheritors, who feast on so-called spider totem avatars. That is to say, beings from all across the multiverse who were empowered by the goddess Neith and her great totems, and were subsequently connected to the mysterious web of life and destiny. This includes every primary Spider-Man in every reality, such as Peter himself, and puts a nice big spider-shaped target on their backs for whenever the Inheritors start feeling peckish. And believe me, you do not want these guys coming after you. Morlun and his whole family are able to boost their physical strength to crazy degrees by draining the energy of living beings, which turns them into nigh unstoppable juggernauts. The stronger the person they drain, the stronger they get, so just try and imagine what happens when they eat a couple spiders in a row. Oh, and by the way, did I mention they can fly? So yeah, any budding spider heroes out there really shouldn't underestimate Morlun and his family, even if they do kinda look like a bunch of slightly too eccentric goths on their way to an interview with a vampire screening. They might actually just straight up eat you. Many of Spider-Man's baddies are based on animals. Even if we just stick with his most famous enemies, we've got a lizard, an octopus, a vulture, a scorpion, a rhino. God, who am I forgetting?
A jackal! Jackal! It's a jackal! It looks like a jackal! 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 It's a jackal!
Oh, right. That guy. Starting his comic book career as just a college professor at Peter's school, Miles Warren developed a rather creepy obsession with his student Gwen Stacy, and ended up blaming Spider-Man for her death. This then drove him mad to the point where he created a second evil personality who dubbed himself the Jackal. This new personality then built a green Jackal suit and even injected Miles' body with Jackal DNA to gain superpowers, all in order to exact his revenge on Spider-Man, which then failed horribly on multiple occasions. But the Jackal has a much bigger claim to fame than just being yet another in a long line of villains to try and kill the web slinger. After all, he's the guy who was behind the infamous clone saga. You see, the Jackal always had a fondness of creating clones to try and mess with Peter, but things got extra complicated when one of his Peter Parker clones were revealed to have survived and got into hiding under the name Ben Reilly. This then set the stage for a years-long, ridiculously convoluted story arc that featured more clones than you can shake a stick at. Now, whether you love or hate this arc, it has continued to influence the Spider-Man mythos ever since, and given us plenty of other Spider-Man doing their own thing independent of Peter, like the aforementioned Ben Reilly and the more gruff Kane Parker, both of whom have gone by the alias of the Scarlet Spider. Knowing that Peter is about to enter college in the MCU, it seems the perfect time to introduce Gwen and Miles. And I, for one, would love to see Miles as the Jackal on the big screen, especially if it leads to the introduction of Ben or Kane. Now, since I said that I won't include villains who have made even minor appearances in the movie so far, I can't actually list Alistair Smythe, even if all he managed to do in his brief appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 2 was accidentally turning Max Dillon into Electro. But that doesn't mean I can't talk about his dad. Introduced back in 1965, back when newspaper owners made a lot of money, Spencer Smythe was a robotics expert who approached J. Jonah Jameson for funding. Realizing that Smythe's robots had the ability to track spiders, Jonah then hired Spencer to build him a Spider Slayer suit and took to chasing Spider-Man around himself. And it was terrifying. And if you're sitting there thinking that the idea of Jonah moonlighting as a supervillain sugar daddy sounds a bit unlikely, try asking McGargan where he got the Scorpion suit. Anyway, once Jonah failed to catch Spidey and blamed Smythe's machines for it, Spencer then became obsessed with defeating Spider-Man, and soon began to build robots that he called Spider Slayers. Robots that I'm sure any 90s kids in the audience will fondly remember from the Spider-Man animated series. These robots caused Spidey plenty of grief throughout his career, until Spencer eventually kicked the bucket, only for his son Alistair to then take the Spider Slayer name for himself. But that's a story for another video. Introduced back in the 60s, Abner Jenkins was an aircraft mechanic who got tired of his job and built himself a suit of superpowered armor to turn to crime instead. You know, as you do in the Marvel universe when the everyday humdrum just becomes a bit too much to bear. While he started out wearing this clumsy soccer-fingered number and fighting the Fantastic Four, he soon upgraded his armor to something much more slick and took to battling Spider-Man instead, usually as a henchman or a mercenary helping out some other villains with their bigger agenda. Now, speaking of working with other baddies, Abner did actually at one point lead a supervillain team called the Sinister Syndicate, but he's probably best known for his time with the Thunderbolts, which was a group of villains disguised as new heroes led by Baron Zemo during a time when most of Marvel's heroes were assumed to be dead. Calling himself Mark I while on this team, Abner soon found the life of a hero much more rewarding than that of a low-rent bad guy, and he actually ended up fully reforming. He then became the leader of his own Thunderbolts team, which was specifically intended to give former villains a chance at a new lease on life. Not too shabby for a former aircraft mechanic, huh? Are you ready for one more insect villain? Or, like, thousands of them? Then say hello to Swarm. Despite his relative obscurity to mainstream audiences and its lack of appearances in much Spider-Man media outside of the comics, Swarm is one of the most infamously bizarre and over-the-top supervillains Marvel has to offer. But that just comes with the territory of essentially being a psychic skeleton covered in bees. To back it up a bit, the German scientist Fritz von Meyer started out working as one of the top toxicologists in the employ of a certain mustache dictator who shall go unnamed here in order to keep YouTube off my back. Managing to escape capture after World War II, Fritz then went to South Africa, where he discovered a colony of intelligent bees that had been mutated by the radiation coming from a nearby meteorite. Intrigued by this, Fritz attempted to take the queen bee for himself for study, only for the hive to violently retaliate and devour everything but his bones, which then somehow transferred his consciousness to the hive, giving him the ability to shape the bees into a new body for himself. And just like that, he then took up the name Swarm and went to New York, where he battled the champions and eventually Spider-Man, who he has gone up against many times since. So wait, you ask, if Swarm is just a bunch of bees, then how does he fight? And I mean, well, have you ever tried punching a bunch of bees? Not only is he pretty much impossible to land a hit on, he can also fly and shapeshift at will, making him a heck of an opponent. He also has psychic control of other bees within a radius of several hundreds of yards, ensuring that he will almost always be able to gather more mass. We're not likely to ever get to see Swarm in any movies anytime soon, given his questionable backstory, at least not without some massive changes. Like that time Spider-Man Maximum Venom had Miles Morales' dad Jefferson Davis arm himself with a swarm of nanotech bees. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, that was a bit of a weird take. Not quite as weird as fascist psychic skeleton beehive though. Another baddie who's been around since the 60s is Frederick Myers, who was originally an Australia-born baseball pitcher who got a bit too greedy for his own good and began accepting bribes to throw his games. Once he got found out and was barred from the sport, Fred was then approached by the Secret Empire and given a set of specialized deadly boomerangs, which he then used to antagonize the Hulk, of all people. Yeah, I don't think anybody at Marvel really thought that one through. After bouncing back and forth between a few other heroes for a while, Boomerang eventually settled for being a general nuisance to Spider-Man specifically. From there, he pretty much just joined any supervillain team that would have him and went around committing robberies as often as the rest of us go grocery shopping. Now, despite what a general sleazeball Fred is, he can be surprisingly charismatic, and for the past decade or so, he's actually been very prominent in the comics. He briefly led his own hilariously ineffective Sinister Six team in the brilliant Superior Foes of Spider-Man series, and even spent some time as Peter's roommate and sidekick to Spider-Man, right until his greed got the better of him and he returned to crime. As a villain, Fred is at best a minor nuisance, but come on, don't pretend it wouldn't rock to see Spider-Man dodge exploding razor-sharp boomerangs for a scene or two. Outside of mad scientists like Dr. Octopus or the Lizard, there's a fair amount of kooky inventors knocking around in Spider-Man's rogues gallery. Like the Tinkerer, who we briefly saw working with Adrian Toomes back in Spider-Man Homecoming. But there is another inventor who people tend to forget about, and that man is Jonas Harrow. After losing his surgeon's license due to performing pretty grisly experiments on people, Jonas quickly slithered into New York's criminal underworld to continue his work. On the day he found a gangster beaten nearly to death and converted him to the metal-plated hammerhead we know and love today, Jonas found his true calling in giving people superhuman enhancements. And whether they wanted him to do so or not was an entirely different matter. Now, outside of Hammerhead, none of Jonas's creations have really joined the ranks of Spider-Man's all-time greatest foes, with his resume including such terrifying individuals as Megawatt, Will-O-the-Wisp, and the Kangaroo. But as silly as some of these enemies may sound or look, they do all pack a mean punch when they get their act together, and Jonas is not above using dirty tactics to get them to dance to his tune if he needs to. And hey, there is a lot of potential to what is essentially a supervillain arms dealer. I mean, somebody needs to pick up the slack after Toomes and his crew got arrested, right? Very few of Spidey's foes are quite as mysterious as the Black Tarantula. Arriving in New York at a time where the criminal underworld was in turmoil, the Black Tarantula quickly got into a tussle with the Rose. He then started to expand his criminal empire by allying himself with another mob boss named Don Fortunato, who demanded that Black Tarantula brought him Spider-Man's mask as proof of his loyalty. Ever the professional, Black Tarantula then went and tracked Spidey down, and gave him the beating of a lifetime. You see, Black Tarantula has a lot more going for him than just being yet another eccentric crime boss in a costume. On top of surpassing Spider-Man on a purely physical level, being both stronger and faster than him, he also possesses a powerful healing factor and even a rather devastating optic blast that makes him an absolute nightmare to fight. And he has expert fight training to back it up too. Turns out that the Black Tarantula is actually a title that has been passed down through the centuries from father to son, ever since the first Black Tarantula was trained by the Hand and given a potion that granted him superpowers. This Black Tarantula, Carlos Lemuerto, is simply the current holder of the title. Another thing that separates Black Tarantula from other Spidey villains is his code of honor. He outright refused to finish Spidey off after seeing him rescue a child, even while he was getting the crap kicked out of him. And he has been known to severely punish his own gang members for attacking the helpless and donating whatever they were paid to charitable causes instead. Honestly, if he wasn't so dead set on the whole hanging around with secret crime rings thing, he would probably make a pretty awesome superhero. Ever since Steve Rogers became Captain America, there have been numerous attempts to recreate the super soldier serum that gave him his powers. And almost every single time, it's gone horribly wrong. Case in point, Adriana Soraya, the Spider Queen. As one of the first female Marines in combat during World War II, Adriana and many other soldiers were exposed to radiation, with her ending up as the only survivor, but showing absolutely no signs of developing superpowers. As the government so often does, they tried to hide their shame by sticking Adriana in an asylum, only for her to break out when she did eventually develop superpowers and go into hiding, resurfacing many years later to harass Captain America, who she blamed for her misfortune. So what kind of superpowers does Adriana have, you ask? Oh, I don't know, all of them? She has super strength, a sonic scream, telepathy, shapeshifting, mind control, you name it, and she can probably do it. But if she's mad at Captain America, then why am I calling her a Spider-Man villain? Well, that would be because she turned almost all of Manhattan into spider monsters that one time. As it turns out, one of Adriana's many powers includes mutagenic saliva that she can use to activate an insect gene in people and give them Spider-Man-esque powers, before eventually mutating them into grotesque spider monsters that she can mind control, because she just didn't have enough powers already. Oh, and she also turns into a giant half-spider monster herself for good measure. Wait, no, come back! I'm not done! I can name way more villains than that! What about Stegron? Big Wheel? Judas Traveler? Hypno Hustler? Please don't go. It gets so dark and cold in here when the video stops and CPR won't let me go outside. Oh, I knew I should have added Black Cat.